It's interesting because there's obviously multiple angles and solutions as to how to go about this and create the world that you want to live in. I tend to be more libertarian and like less regulation, less government across the board is generally a good idea. I do like how you mentioned like the sewage system
Yeah,
because that does make me think of DAOs, which you start to see right now with platforms like Minds. So they're trying to become a DAO. They're in the process of doing that, which ends up being user owned and the users are voting and you actually can get paid based off of your engagement and if you decide to sell your data. So it gives you a lot more agency and as to how you participate in social platforms. Their CEO I think is amazing and I really hope that he does well. But I think it comes down, and I know that some people aren't in favor of the whole personal accountability thing, but to me, it it's kind of like a mix between personal accountability and the collective when you were talking about the
totally.
moms and the lead, right? So if we all say this is bullshit, we know what's happening, and then you leave these platforms and you go to ones that actually care about the users like Minds and you support that those systems and the other companies like Twitter won't have a base. They won't have anything to profit off of.
I have a lot of sympathy for that, but I also think I think you're right that there's two levels at which we've got to do this, right? There's all sorts of things we can do as individuals, and people who want to leave these platforms, I give them, and develop platforms built around different principles. I have a huge amount of sympathy for. I think in terms of libertarianism, I think what's interesting about this is we can build really broad coalitions around this because, I'm not aware of any the most super hardcore libertarian doesn't think we shouldn't have a sewage system that's collectively
Right.
owned. And the
Right.
most hardcore libertarian doesn't think we should legalize lead poisoning again, right? So
Right.
there are
Yeah.
certain, even really, really, I mean, you'd have to be a total abolish the government anarchist. I mean, there are some, and some of my
Yeah.
friends, in fact, it's not
Yeah.
no disrespect to them, but I think there are certain things that we almost everyone agrees the government should do some things. There's some people who say the government should do very, very little, and that's a
Right.
perfectly legitimate position. And I have lots of friends who take that position. But even the people who say very, very little would say, well, sewers getting poison out of the air are pretty good ones. And
Mhm.
I would argue, and other people would disagree, and it's a perfectly legitimate debate. Dealing with these factors, I would put now in the category. I think it's pretty close to lead poisoning, and it's if there are things that are so profoundly degrading our attention. But you're absolutely right. The fight for that, sometimes it's framed as, and you're not smartly not doing this. Sometimes it's framed as there's two ways of thinking about this: as either individual responsibility or collective action. And I always say
Mhm.
to people, obviously we need both. Right? I mean, it's
Both.
obvious, right? It's bizarre to set them again. And collective responsibility is a form of individual responsibility, right? Like
Mhm.
collective action only happens if lots of individuals come together and do it. It's not like
Exactly.
I'm not saying wait for some political messiah to deliver it to us. That'll never happen, right?
Right.
The if you think about those moms whose kids were being poisoned, the way they took individual responsibility was by acting together, right?
Mhm.
So I think your instinct and my instinct is right. These are not separate things, right?
Mhm.
I mean, well, they're separate to some degree. Obviously, I'll give you an example of a purely individual act that I recommend everyone doing. These guys should so be paying me commission. I promise you, I'm not the product I'm about to mention. I'm not getting any money for plugging this, but I noticed their sales have massively gone up since I started talking about them. So over in the corner of the room there, I have something called a K safe. It's a plastic safe. You take off the lid, you put in your phone, you put on the lid, you turn the dial, and it will lock away your phone for anything between 5 minutes and a whole day. Right?
Mhm.
I will not sit down with my partner and watch a film unless we both imprison our phones. I will not let people come round for dinner unless we both put our phones in the phone jail. I write 4 hours a day. I imprison my phone then. On this laptop, I have an app called Freedom, which locks away, which cuts you off. It can either cut you off from specific websites, say you had a problem with Twitter or Pornhub or whatever it might be, it will shut you out of them, or it can shut you off from the entire internet for however long you tell it to. And once you've done it, you can't get it back when it's just nothing you can do. So those are two examples of like purely individual forms of personal responsibility that I take every day and I'm passionately in favor of. But again, you can sort of see how the individual responsibility interacts with collective responsibility when we think about another layer of this. So loads of people listening will have heard me say what I just said, that I put my phone away for 4 hours a day. And they're going to think, well, fuck you, I can't do that. My boss might text me, right? At any
Mhm.
minute of the day or not. I can't do that. I get fired. Screw. It doesn't sound like lovely advice. It's like a kind of taunt to them, right? And there's a solution to that I think has to come collectively. So in France in 2018, they had a huge crisis of what they called le burnout, which I don't think you need me to translate. And the French government was trying to figure out why so many people were getting burned out. So they set up a kind of inquiry to figure it out, an investigation. And one of the things they discovered is that 35% of French workers felt they could never stop checking their phone or email because their boss could message them at any time of the day or night. And if they didn't answer, they'd be in trouble. And you can see what a big change that is in the economy, right? I remember when I was a kid, the only people who were on call were doctors, and they weren't on call all the time, right? Whereas now, almost half the economy is always on call. And you can see, I can give those people all the lovely self-help advice in the world about, you want to sleep more, unplug, you'll feel better, your attention. They can't do it, right? So the French government, under pressure from kind of collective movements, introduced a really simple legal reform that deals with a big part of this. It's called the right to disconnect. And it just gives every French worker two rights. The first right is you have a right to your work hours to be legally defined in your contract. And secondly, you have a legal right, unless you're being paid overtime, to not check your phone or email outside those work hours. So I went to Paris before the plague struck to talk to people. Just before I was there, Rentokil, the big pest control company, got fined 70,000 euros for trying to get one of their workers to check his email an hour after he left work. Now, you can see how that's a thing, a collective thing. I mean, you could have companies start to offer that as an inducement to people as well, because there's a competitive labour market at the moment. But you can see how that's a collective change that frees people up to make the individual changes they want to make. So you've got both those levels. So a lot of people, if they were given a right to disconnect, would be able to use the case save, would be able to use freedom in a way they can't at the moment.